Sam, how are you, Sam? You doing all right?
Hi, yeah, good.
Good. Seth came to visit.
Hello,
Seth
hello.
Dellinger, he's been at the net before. He does amazing work on the musicality of being. And Daniel Coughlan, how are you doing, Daniel? You doing okay?
I'm doing very well. It's good to see you
Well,
all.
it's an honor
See
to
you,
have you,
Daniel.
sir. Thank you for coming. Sam is awesome. This is Seth. He's visiting the house, and he just got to experience one of our Virginia doom storms. So that was really fun. I'm sorry, we're still alive, Javier. We didn't die, actually. But all the windows were leaking. Seth, this is Seth. He watched the. It's like when Dave. It's like just the roof of the barn likes blowing off when we have people come. So that is a lot of fun. But it is good to see you, and I hope everything is well. Well, Seth and I were talking about things like the experience of thinking. What is that is like a mode of rest by which to go about life and not to be like stressed and different things. I would be curious, Seth, if you wanted to share any of those things, because I think it's a really interesting topic.
The conversation was just that Daniel and I were outside earlier today, and I had my journal and I was writing a bit, and then later he casually said, "Oh, well, what were you thinking about?" And what came to me was all the moments when I was writing and I couldn't think of what else to say. So I put the pen down and it was just kind of blank. And then after however much time I picked it up again and suddenly there was something to write. Like some idea had come, but it was what we were talking about was the actual phenomenological experience of the thinking, like where do the ideas come from? And actually following up a little bit with Michelle, also what we were talking, but there's that sense of like, if I quiet the mind, well, I'm not thinking about anything. Maybe I should be thinking about something. Oh, is it okay not to be thinking right now? And so that feeling of like, and then that could of course lead to thinking, but it's a kind of a stressed out thinking where the inner space is kind of contracted. And yet, what is that if it doesn't appear that I'm thinking because I can't locate any thoughts in my head, but then when I come out of that space, there's a new idea. And the just sort of the flip side that I was talking with Michelle about there is like, well, if my mind is sort of empty and I don't actively try to put a thought in it or do something, it must be that I'm not worried that I should be thinking about something. So the whole thing is actually very paradoxical and kind of funny, but that's
Oh
that's what we
yeah.
were talking about.
No,
Or just last thing I'll say is
yeah.
like I just noticed like how often do we actually think about the topic of thinking? It just felt to me like a fresh conversation, like I wasn't sure I'd reached any final conclusion, but I thought I don't know that I've often been given this opportunity to even think about this. And of course, the default would be thinking, to get something done or in the institutional schooling context. And so it just felt refreshing to sort of be in the place of not knowing about this fundamental human activity.
No, I think it's just very interesting. And Dimitri, Javier, Michael, thank you for being here. And for you and Dimitri, it is good to see you. And again, the phenomenology of thinking is very interesting. Like when you actually think about what it is like to think. We were also talking about stuff like, when you're thinking about business or entrepreneurship or stuff like that. Often there's this idea that you need to be stressed about getting customers. You need to be thinking constantly, how I'm going to make this successful. But actually, interesting enough, that very intention can get in the way of actually being able to do what you need to do in business or being the kind of person that carries themselves in a way that people want to work with. And how also people, I see this at the wedding venue very often. And Christian, good to see you, sir. And at the wedding venue very often, there's almost a sense where people like, if I'm not stressed about the wedding day, that means I don't care about it. So I need to be stressed to show that I care. And how I think also we do that with thinking, where if I'm not stressed in my thinking, like if I'm not like, oh, really try, like you're actually getting in the way or you're not deeply thinking, I think we're also drunk on associating thinking with studying at school and homework and staying up late and cramming. And so there's this idea that like intention and this kind of hard rigor is where ideas come from. But really, very often, it's just very funny that and I know we've talked about this before, but it's just very interesting. I find that thinking is way more like daydreaming, where you're going about your day and thoughts just kind of manifest and appear, and where actually the name of the game is to have created an environment where you can almost be, I guess the example we made in the kitchen is kind of like a starter You know how you have starters like a bread starter where you fill it with yeast and different things and then it kind of grows on its own? I often think that thinking is more like that than a calculator, where you're putting self things inside of you that can then like start. Mr. Luber, good to see you. We didn't die. I'm glad to say that. So that was good. And that actually then carrying yourself in a certain mode of, dare I say, rest or just kind of letting things pass through you. Thinking is very mysterious when you pay attention to thinking. And I think when you get actually like trying to be aware of the phenomenology of thinking, that may also enhance our capacity to think. But I'll pass it to Michael and then anyone who wants to speak.
So great to see Seth with you as well. Um, I feel like whenever I see you and Michelle with the earbuds, I just feel like you're like conjoined twins or something. And so now you've adopted a new Siamese twin. It's great. Um, yeah, this is a great topic, and I know you've kind of I think Daniel, you in your conversations with Seth and Aspasia, you've kind of talked around this before, this kind of meta discussion about thinking, and it's very interesting because like I often will find that like my best inspirations for poems or even if it's just, like a journal entry, it comes from doing something else in the world as opposed to like I'm gonna sit down and write a poem. Because you hear some advice from writers who are like, like you need to write every day and you just need to sit down and, don't wait for inspiration to strike, just sit down and like, even if something's shitty, like just kind of trust that something will come about it. And I think there's value in that advice. Um, I don't know if it just doesn't work for me or I don't, if I'm not disciplined enough or whatever, but I find that like when I feel like I'm trying to like wring when I feel like I'm like trying to like wring ideas out, like it's like a towel and I'm trying to like get all the water out and I'm starting to like struggle. It's like it's time for me to go do the laundry or go make lunch or go for a run or whatever. Um, and that kind of like that strike of idea that comes and it seems like it's either from an encounter, like a relational encounter in the world that kind of breaks a frame, or if it's like something that you're doing, it's almost like you have to distract yourself enough to allow the subconscious to like bubble up to the conscious. Like if you kind of try and shine a spotlight on your subconscious, it's like it runs away or something. It gets scared. Um, so yeah, that's with my writing process, that's what I find um to be true. And like right now I'm at a friend's beach house that they graciously let me stay in, and I went in the ocean this morning and like, it's like cold Northern California ocean, and it's like whenever I go in and I come out, there's like a sense of aliveness, but there's also kind of like a comatose where like I feel more alive, but like my thoughts are not maybe as sharp, but there is like a different elevated form of consciousness. I can't really describe it. And so yeah, I feel like it's like there's different levels of kind of I don't know, sharpness or clarity of thinking, but I think there's also flow states that we can get in where um like it's like our being is more alive, but our thinking might not necessarily be, we might not be like our most philosophically or intellectually like acute, but we're able to like move in space, or we're able to like engage somatically or something. Um, and I know, Seth, you probably have a lot of ideas about kind of the interplay between the mind and the body, and like when there are moments where like, maybe the body is kind of reigning supreme as opposed to the mind, or, vice versa, or, kind of when they're like really harmonizing together. Um, Yeah.
What's very interesting is I think everything you're getting at is exactly, Mr. Jochen, good to see you, is because like, so for example, most of the time the idea of thinking is study, like read, et cetera, so forth. But this idea of no, actually get into the cold ocean, and that somehow actually creates thinking, which would then suggest thinking is far more environmental. It is far more, I think also something that Seth and I were talking about is the idea that if thinking actually is more kind of a daydreaming activity where it just kind of emerges, right? This right here would destroy mind-body dualism because actually you need your body to be going through environments and doing things that then you stimulate you just thinking without realizing you're thinking. And what you think because you've read certain books, you've had certain conversations, then what emergently comes up because of the use of the body, because of things that are going around, then X thought comes up that you just find yourself thinking without even realizing it, right? Because you're using your body and going through environments. Well, we've talked, Mr. Jocko, we've talked about the importance of, say, virtue. Well, if you are virtuous, the sort of kind of way that you're going to carry yourself in conversations and environments are going to be different. Javier, Michelle, and Joachim were talking about geopedia, and Joachim was actually at the house 2 days ago. So we've had a blast. And Haven and Mr. Joachim had a conversation about philosophy and video games. So Haven was on cloud nine. And he's like, finally, finally. So that was great. But on the idea that actually different environments are actually going to lead to different things coming out. And actually the brain, again, if it's almost better as a kind of starter, like there are things that have been put in it, like a bread starter, then those things can actually come out because of the way you're moving through environments. But that also makes me think, and I'll give it to Seth, and then I'll give it to Javier and Christian, and then Aspasia, good to see you, is the idea that actually, if you were at home at your body, or you actually were to train your awareness, because Seth has been doing these daily videos, daily ground, he can speak to it on actually sort of these practices that actually are trying to tap into kind of a musicality of being. But I'll give it to Seth because I think that's also a sort of thing that actually is meeting the conditions so that thinking can emerge in this kind of high order causal way.
Well, I was actually thinking of something similar to what you already just said, that like we could think about thinking in terms of I'm sitting here trying to notice my thinking right now. But I could also ask, like, what did I do since I woke up till the time I go to bed? Or what have I been doing for the last 4 days? Like, if my schedule's been very busy, that already says something about the thinking. The thinking is sort of going to be happening in the background. Like, if there's an actual, I don't know, some sort of thorny knot I'm trying to work out, I'm still going to go to the grocery store. But it might be while I'm at the store that something happens, But it just kind of occurred to me today that one way of thinking of my schedule is curating the environment of my thinking.
Yes.
Like, so am I setting up my day so that thinking actually works out well? Because of course I could just put a series of activities and say, yes, there's enough hours in the day to do all of that, but the thinking gets squeezed. And also what you were saying about, it's like we've been talking. If you haven't visited Daniel, it's basically the net all day long around here, including with his children. So that's and Michelle. I mean, it's really. I was thinking, why is Haven talking about morality and discernment? Because I didn't know what that was when I was 9 years old. But yeah. Well, I mentioned the daily ground since Daniel mentioned it. It's just if anyone is interested, I can share the information where to get it. But basically, I'm sharing every day for the next 3 weeks, just a 5-minute little audio lesson that there's a variety of things, but working with breath or working with attention or self-touch, different things that in 5 minutes can sort of be these little reset moments in your day. And when I originally created it, I don't know that I was thinking about what we're talking about now, but it could potentially impact the quality of thinking throughout the day. I mean, I know this past weekend I was in a sort of let's just say a negative mood, and I went for a contact improvisation event. I don't know if people here are familiar with that dance form, but basically people get together and it's a free form dance and there's movement and there's touch. And I just noticed when I left that the thinking was not negative anymore. And I hadn't been thinking while I was there. I've been just moving my body around, but it was like So if the body is the physical container which thinking takes place inside of, if mind is inside the body or whatever the relationship is, but the point being that you can work with the body and the ripple effect will influence the thinking. So that's what I would say.
I think that's brilliantly put. Daily ground, and I really like the phrase, I'll give it to Javier, Christian, Luber, Daniel, and Dimitri, is that this idea of curating an environment for thinking. I do not think we look at our schedule or think about our day as, am I curating environments in which thinking can occur, can just happen? Well, we can think of the Geopedia as creating an environment where thinking can just occur. I also think that we don't like, I think like in a conversation like this, you see the true character of thinking more than a guy with his head on a rock, right? This kind of organic sort of activity. How would we live differently if we thought about curating environments for thinking? I think that's an extremely valuable phrase. I'll give it to Javier here. Javier, please.
Was it me, Luber, and Jock, and I've been reading Al-Ghazali, so there's a really good like Al-Ghazali kind of quote of the body needs to be a vessel filled with water so air doesn't go in, kind of thing. You could think of it in such a way that this body as a vessel, when it becomes blocked, there's an air inside. But I would like to make a distinction. If we elaborate on thinking, because Seth kind of brought it up a little bit, which is this idea of like moods and appetite, passions, desire. I think the reason why when you want to think and then all of a sudden you start desiring and craving to put something, desperately, the passions start taking over, in my opinion. That's why it makes sense that taking a break, it's funny that we would say just stop thinking about it, but I actually think it's the connection of how emotional it gets when you want to put something into words. It already links to our frustration as like human beings, the fact that I cannot articulate something, and I'm struggling to articulate something. It frustrates me. So it seems like thinking, what we call thinking is, or actually, let's think in the negative. What happens when we can't think? The process of not being able to think further past something has to do with the fact that we have to make a clearing in the body. But that clearing in the body has to do with our emotions and frustrations and desires, really, versus our like actual thinking. Like we actually, a lot of the work for thinking is to simply make a clearing. And we have to do the clearing of the body because it's the emotions and frustrations and desires that clog us up when we want to think about something. And so I think a lot of the work of so-called thinking is really just having a clearing, making a clearing. And of course, like I'd say it's environmental and I'd say it's body related for sure. I think it's, clogging up, constipation. Yeah. Stress is like a real constipation in thinking. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
I think the idea, and I'll give it to Christian here, and then Luber, Daniel, and Dimitri. I think the idea that primarily clearing seems to be a prerequisite for thinking is a very big deal. And that often when you're desiring to think, then that creates problems, right? And maybe a lot of all of the tensions between thinking, emotions actually are a result of desiring to think as opposed to actually doing the work of a clearing to think. Maybe all of those problematic overreaches have come from the wrong relation to the thinking because you're desiring to think, I think. And then also it just makes me think of authentic resonance, as Aspasia, Seth, and I have been talking about. And Seth's going to learn, I'm going to rip this out of his ear at least 7 times, is that you see, if instead you're just following the authentic resonance to choose what you're going to read, who you're going to like, the decisions you make, then that becomes the leading kind of agent for the possibility of thinking as opposed to the desire to think. The activity of authentic resonance. Details can be added to that, but I like what you were saying on clearing. It makes me think of Mr. Wynn on letting, etc. But let me give it to Christian here. Christian, it's good to see you, sir. I hope you are doing well. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. You see me in my frog form. I will turn into a handsome prince if anyone kisses me. But my question is that I feel like maybe there was like in the 8 minutes that I missed at the top of the meeting, a little bit of context for the thinking question that I'm like very hungry to know what it was. If you could, Dan.
No, absolutely. Some of it was me talking about almost dying in the wind and the storm, but not dying. So that was cool. Even though like the barn roof was almost ripped off. So that was neat. Part of it was this idea, Seth and Michelle and I were talking in the kitchen on kind of this idea that if you pay attention to the experience of thinking, like the phenomenology of thinking, it's very odd because often like you'll stop thinking, like Seth was talking about how you'll be writing in your journal, then you'll stop. And then suddenly you'll start writing again. And there's kind of this question of, was the stopping where you weren't thinking part of the thinking actually? Or was it actually the suspension of thinking? What's very odd is if you actually pay attention to how thinking works, it's really mysterious. It's like very odd where ideas come from and how thinking is. And we have all these images from school that thinking is a result of studying or really, sweating at the brow and making things work, when really the experience of it can be much more mysterious. So there's a bit of thinking about thinking and what exactly we do in order for thinking to emerge. And it seems much more, say, environmental, curating an environment for thinking to occur, creating a clearing within. Actually, say, not having guilt or doing things that you're not supposed to do that then are in your subconscious mind that are keeping there from being a clearing. Or Michael was making the example of jumping into the ocean and the cold water making the body alive, and then something occurs with thinking. So that's generally what we were discussing, the kind of the experience of thinking itself.
And the mysteries therein. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there, as you guys are talking, the first thing that popped into my head was a poem that my mother found that I had written in a school assignment. I want to say in like 3rd grade or thereabouts, which was just about taking the bus to school and having all of these thoughts in my head that won't stop. And so like the unbearable flow of thinking or the not the problem of why can I not think, but how come my brain never stops thinking, right? And I actually like had what I think might have been an insight. You never know what you're just kind of like creating when you're having deep therapeutic / spiritual / psychoactive experiences. But I had like a early childhood memory recall or memory fabrication wherein I was a little kid sitting in the back seat of the car, being a blabbermouth, blah, 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 and then suddenly realizing that no one was listening to what I was saying. That like my words were like just going into the ether, and where previously I had been getting recognition and intelligibility from the other party, that suddenly there was like, oh no, actually I'm not communicating. I'm just talking out loud to myself. And in my memory recall, I remember, and again, I don't know if this is real, it's just total fabrication, my unconscious coming up with creative solutions to mysteries. But as I experienced this supposed memory, I like kind of at some level of my own intelligence decided to just talk to myself in my head. And as I was, having that experience of a supposed memory, I also felt at some level of my intelligence that this was like a weird thing to do. that this is like a little it's like something was wrong with doing this, and yet my desire to communicate and express myself was so strong that I had to do it anyways. Or at least I decided to do it anyways. I'm like, all right, well, I guess I'm just going to talk to myself now. This is kind of weird, but I don't have anyone else to talk to. So that's one possible answer to this question. I'm like, why did little Christian never stop thinking in his own, skull all the time? The other, well, and I could go on at length, but I don't want to because it will be very lengthy. Just I could talk a lot about my evolving relationship to thinking, the experience of not thinking, the great peace of not thinking, and the disidentifying with the voice in my head, which is an interesting thing to do, which I think it then makes it feel, as you said, Daniel, much more like a daydream. It's like it's just this phenomenological experience. And one of the practices that like really kind of brought that relationship to my own thought process into like a more steady form was, well, I should say, first of all, I was doing breath work, right? Like holotropic breathing, Wim Hof, whatever. So already in a slightly altered state of consciousness. But then the question occurred to me, like, what are my thoughts made out of? And all that really did was become a pointer to engaging with the thought process in a purely aesthetic way, so to speak, like the pure qualia of the thought process. And I'm just noticing like the volume of the voice, the tone of the voice, the subtle imagery that appears as the words stream through, and the kind of non-reality of the voice, right? Like, where does it exist in this field of space? And just all of the things except for the actual symbolic meaning, the actual so-called content of the thoughts. And that was really interesting because because I was no longer looking for the meaning of the words. First of all, I mean, my relationship to them changed drastically, which is interesting. But then they just kind of puttered out, right? And then you realize that like your brain is generating words, and then you are interpreting your own thoughts at some level, which is kind of an interesting idea. It makes me think that, like, if you lived in a country where you didn't know the language and never learned the language, at some point, maybe as you're dreaming, you would still start to hear that language in your dreams, even though, and maybe even like properly spoken, even though you don't know what it means. So anyways, I just noticed, when I stop caring about what the words mean, the kind of fuel that keeps the thought process going seems to die down a bit, which can be nice. And then the last thing I'll say is this idea of like the striving in order to get whatever the objective of the thinking is. I remember when I first started trying to write songs when I was like 19. I finally found some chords I liked on my guitar. I was like, yes, this is my first song, I can tell. And these are great chords. And then I just sat in my room for like 2 days just trying to come up with a melody. And I couldn't, nothing. And really working hard, just like, throwing paint at the wall, nothing sticking. And then I got exhausted and I took a nap. And as I was falling asleep, I just heard the melody. I was like, oh, that's really nice. This is really good. And then I showed it to my friends, and I'm like, there's no way you wrote this. And I'm like, I kind of didn't. I just, I just like heard it. Anyways, so I've noticed that a lot of times that's a pattern that's repeated very much, which is like, I kind of know what I'm striving toward, whether that's in uncovering a solution to a problem or trying to do something creative or whatever. And I stick with the energy more than care about the results, right? I'm like, I feel passionate. I'm like moving towards it. I'm working. And at this point, I don't even like, I have no pessimism about whether I'm gonna get there or not. It's just like I just, work in a way that feels good, and typically I'll either get there kind of in route, or it pops up later, after with some silence. I let the subconscious, kind of digest, I think, everything that I've been doing, and then it kind of shoots something out later, which is nice.
Magnificent. I'll give it to Daniel, Dimitri, Aspasia, and Michael. What I say, I love the phrase unbearable flow of thinking. And also in this kind of double weird thing of where when you're trying like meaning, like when you finally just kind of free yourself from the meaning of the thoughts and just have the aesthetic experience, actually then there can be you can get away, like you can kind of enjoy them more. They don't have the same sort of unbearable quality to them. But then that's very interesting because that also suggests the double-edged sword of meaning, right? There's an idea that if life is meaningless, there's a problem. But then there's also the idea of everything has meaning. You start making connections, or you have to hold on to everything. And it's the Thomas Pynchon novel or something like that. I think also for me personally that I find my relationship with thinking is proper if I feel like I kind of didn't. I really like that phrase. When the thoughts going through my head feel like they're kind of not mine, that's proper. When things are wrong is when I say those are my thoughts. That actually tends to be a strong indication that I'm doing something wrong, actually. Like if I can identify, and that's when like they become bad thoughts or anger or judgmental or mad at somebody. But when my experience of thought is it's kind of not like mine, that it's kind of not mine, which then has this daydreaming sort of going through the day passive quality, then it is that's very interesting because the more I feel able to do that, because I've had that experience of the unbearable flow of thinking that never stops. But the more actually I could relate to the thinking with a kind of like it's not mine, the more they just kind of naturally go away. But then they spring back in a productive way, like Seth was saying. You stop and then they kind of come back. That is very interesting, and it is something. And then also, I'll just say that, and then I'll give it to Daniel. On that comment on following the emotion, like following the energy, we were talking about that last night on following the novelty. I don't know where this thing is going to go. I don't even know if there's anything here, but it's interesting, or I find energy there. And the world will say, well, if you don't know the outcome, you shouldn't do it. When actually, it's the exact opposite. It's like if you feel that energy, it just shows that we don't trust things. If you can't give an explanation, we say it's not real. When actually, I would argue that when you follow the energy, you tend to be far more productive, far more fulfilled, far more happier, because you're following that energy and you're able to arrive at something that otherwise may have never been given to. But I would associate that as well with authentic resonance. But I will give it to Daniel. Daniel, it is a pleasure to have you here, sir. Thank you for making the time. It is a delight.
It's really awesome to be here. I was thinking about thinking today, so it's really great, really appropriate. Um, the yeah, I in kind of like yogic science, they talk about certain like the idea is kind of like you can be subjected to repetition of thoughts on a daily basis. Like I don't know if you notice, like every day you kind of have the same thoughts, and that kind of persists through. It's a And we are subjected to that in a way, but that it's always kind of humorous to me that there is that repetition. Like the same thoughts happen on a daily basis, and there's almost like a timing to the time of the day or the specific moment that's going on. It's the same thought that arrives. But I thought it was relevant because I know Seth is into movement or doing working with movement, and Javier brought in that quote in the beginning, and Daniel said curating space for thought, and for me this always goes to essentially the body, like what the body as the place where the thought is curated. Then Dimitri, I'm assuming next he's going to bring the dialogue and introspection, like where's thought happening. That's at least a comment that he made. But so I was in crisis maybe like a week ago because a lot of what I was realizing I've grounded so much of what I've thought philosophy is in dialogue. So I've really like prioritized dialogue. Like if I'm not thinking with another person in speech, then I'm not really like doing philosophy. Was there's the other work like you reading or whatever, but I was really prioritizing dialogue. Then I realized that I might be there might be a kind of a limit there, or it was actually Cadell who prompted the crisis the dialogue into dialectic, and I realized that maybe I've underworked dialectic. So then I picked up Parmenides, and I've been trying to go through those 8 hypotheses. So today when I was thinking about thinking, I kind of knew that I wanted to get to these 8 hypotheses, just try and think them. And I was in this state for most of the day where I'm like, I know that at some stage in the day I'm going to try and think it, but I'm thinking it in terms of like I'm reading some material, I'm making notes, but I still have in the back of my mind, I'm going to think it at some stage. And then only like at like 4 o'clock, I'm like, okay, now I'm gonna think the thought. If one is, and then that's it's so strangely simple, the thought of it. And then for me, when I'm thinking in a slowed down way, which for me feel like there's many distinctions I think we can make in thought, like slow thinking, fast thinking, etc. But when I'm thinking in this way, that it feels like the thoughts curating a space is noticing, and this is also kind of like the I guess the personal phenomenology of thought, like what it feels like, or what the experience is like to think. There's when like this moment when the breath changes from in to out and then out to in, like the gap in between the two. If I'm the less cognizant I am of that gap, the more thought is just like rolling on itself and almost degrading itself. And that means like a certain accumulation of tension in the body. It means I can sustain a particular line, but the more I sustain it, the more it degrades itself. The more cognizant I am of the gap, and this is where I don't know what to say. Like the thought is fresher, or it's renewed. It's renewed in some way. But that makes sense. Like this is known yogic science stuff. Like I have deep sleep, and we need that kind of gap, or that moment of transcendence and we can do that intentionally by practicing. Yeah,
I think it's a brilliant comment, and I'll throw it at Aspasia if we can get to it before you run. But that point about, but it's so interesting because basically, if you just go through the schooling system and do what it is to think, and thinking is reading a book and studying and different things, and you never do any of the stuff that you were just describing. Like it becomes so important to have practice. Like if thinking is actually tied to the gap in this way, this sort of actually being intentional about the gap and actually being intentional about the suspension of thinking and the curation of environments, then basically the way that we are habituated to think in the society is completely wrong. And this is very, very problematic. But I will give it to Miss Aspasia. Aspasia, look, it's Seth. Look, it's Seth Aspasia. Look.
So nice to see you guys together. I don't have long. I just wanted to throw in, to me, thinking is an umbrella term, and there's just so much that sits underneath it that we try and capture with the word. And there's also, I think there's just the caution of, there's also thinking that is worry and rumination. So that's obviously what I see all the time in my work. And people showing up almost feeling that they're doing the right thing, that somehow that is the message that they're receiving from around them, is that they should be forcing themselves to be thinking more, and that when they have an emotion, they're supposed to respond to that by and we were talking about this the other day, the three of us, that we're supposed to go and sit by ourselves somewhere alone, and then we're supposed to go in and start thinking in depth about our problem, and start, and especially something like CBT, pros and cons and problem solving. And obviously there's a time, it's a skill to have to be able to do that if you are alone. But it's really reinforced currently, this idea that that is supposed to be a private activity, that you should be able to manage yourself. You should go into your own, and we even teach children this from very young in the schooling system over here. It's bizarre, that this is resilience, and go and be alone and think for a long time, and that somehow this is going to manage and control your feelings, and then you'll be in control, and you'll be good, and you'll be it's such an error. It's just such an error. And there's not enough spoken about, especially early on, about thinking together. And that's really how I think about parenting, when you have the time and space to do it well, is teaching our children that they can come and think with us, and we can do it together, and not just sending people off to think alone. So worry and rumination, I think, are being confused often with what maybe would otherwise be something like philosophy. There are ways that you can obviously harness thought, but it's very easy to fall down the slippery slope of worry and rumination. So I wanted to throw that out there. I was writing as everyone was talking about, because I was thinking about what that umbrella term thinking means to me. I was just writing all the different ways that thinking I engage in thinking. So I've got thinking that comes to me, which is much more like this idea of the clearing out, like sort of the being able to get into a state where you can clear the way, set the conditions. And it is still thinking, but it's a kind of thinking that, that feels like it arises and I am able to experience. And you have to be able to discern the quality of that from this other self-imposed, very sort of forceful, I'm going to sit down now and be very serious and really think about something. Yes, so there's thinking that comes to me, thinking that I will into existence, which is probably what I just said, thinking that is coping with pain. So there's also thought that we engage in that really is purely just to avoid feelings, and to avoid them completely, not to make sense of them or to regulate anxiety, but it really is just about trying to completely suppress them, get away from them, disown them. And then we miss the message that might be in the feeling state as well. Thinking that is reminding me of my own contours. So this idea that I always have my own thoughts. There is, like, at least for me and lots of people, there is something nourishing about knowing that I can always have that. It's, that's the one thing that someone else can't own. Thinking that is worry or rumination. Thinking that is evacuating the parts of me I cannot own, which is closer to psychosis. Thinking that is superego and internalized other. Thinking with others to create that which is not yet thought but is known to me. And thinking that is freedom from thinking. So, I mean, there's obviously a whole heap more, but the problem I always find in these conversations when we go to thinking is that for me, it's just such a loose term. And it seems to also capture emotion, it captures memories, it captures urges, desire. Like it's really just internal experience that we're talking about, isn't it, when we're talking about thinking here? Because so I find that difficult to just focus in on one aspect of it. But if the question is more around what is the quality of, or what is the phenomenology of thinking when we are experiencing it in a manner that feels, what is it? What is it that we're asking exactly? That it feels that it's creative in nature, or that it is meaningful. Then I think that's something, and I guess this is really all just authentic resonance, isn't it? That is definitely something that you can, I hate using the word train, but I'll use the word train because you know what I mean. It's something we can train ourselves, I guess, to be able to discern the difference. But it's tough. It's just tough out there, because even in, we have conversations. Oh, sorry, it's just something popped up on my screen about lowering my hand. Even though we have conversations like this here together, some people don't even have this kind of thing in their life. You go back out into the world, and there is a lot of emphasis on you should go and do your thinking alone, and that's sort of your due diligence, and then come into relationship when you have something to say, or when you've thought through it sufficiently. And I think that's really painful and isolating, and there is so much we cannot think well without another person. And so I just want to bring that relational piece in. I know it's already been brought in, but the thinking we do together just shouldn't be understated. And maybe that is the most important kind of thinking. And it's in the service of, as a backup, we can also do some thinking alone if there's no one else with us. But I tend to, I was relating to, I'm sorry, I forgot who, it might have been Christian was saying it earlier. I was relating to the relationship to thought and thinking from an early age as being sort of a place that I used to go to because I noticed around me no one was really interested in what I was saying. And so I experienced the same thing. And so I have this whole sort of imaginary world that I crafted in my head, and I existed there. And so I'm very good at thinking, but if when I go to that place now, I kind of just recognize it for what it is. And it's often, it's oftentimes just a comfort thing, or it's a reprieve, but that's not, it's a very different quality. Anyway, I will shut up now. I have to go anyway, but this is amazing. I always love being here so much. And I know I'm always in the chat and I'm very rarely speaking, but it's just a hard time of morning for me to be speaking.
It's
So
like 5 in the morning,
leave.
you saint. You saint
It's
woman.
well, yeah, it's past 6 a.m. now. Yeah. Sometimes I'm here at 5. Yeah.
Well,
And I'm just
yeah.
watching the sunrise. So I'll leave the conversation going, but I'm gonna have to turn all this off. But
Well,
it's
you're
lovely to
very
see you.
well. Everything you said is fantastic, and we love you in the chat. And thank you for making the time. And what you were saying, I think, is very important. I'll give it to Dimitri, Michael, Sam, and Christian, and anyone else. And I think also, just as a quick comment, the very fact that thinking is such a broad category almost suggests that if we're active about our thinking rather than having thinking arise, then we've already lost. Because the many different ways by which we could apply it or define it, the likelihood we will do it correctly is very low. There's something about trusting the body to actually, whatever arises within you is the proper internal experience for the moment. But you have to have some sort of trust with yourself to believe that. You have to also, say, be working on yourself and doing the training. And, we've talked about virtue, geopedia, seeking all of these different things to actually be able to trust what is naturally arising. Because if you actually try to decide what kind of thinking is needed, like the possibilities of your internal state are so broad that the probability of doing that right is very, very low. You almost like the funny thing is thinking almost seems to always already be trusting the body because the thought's just there. There's almost always already a certain trusting that of which is beyond you in the very way it appears. And it's like, if you don't just kind of own that, perhaps there's some trouble you end up with. The thing I'll also say quickly is that what you were saying about thinking together, yes, I think thinking is primarily, thinking is deeply about relation and doing it with other people. But if we don't associate our friends as people we do philosophy with, then we can't have that, and we're stuck with thinking alone. And if we can't even think well alone, then our thinking crushes us. And so if we don't have a culture of, say, philosophical discussion or actually engaging in larger topics, which then I think basically we're in huge trouble, that is very dire. And also, please note, what is the character of thinking in a conversation? You often find yourself saying things you didn't know you were going to say. It's not like you think of every word before you say it. Thinking in conversation is a thinking of arising, just like you were saying. And basically, the more you do that, the more you may habituate yourself to be able to do that alone, actually. And so then you find yourself in alone. It's like there's a community that you're still carrying with you because of your friends and relations. And so then it becomes back and forth, right? If we do thinking alone, I think we end up in a lot of trouble. I do agree with that, but let me give it to Dimitri here. Dimitri, thank you, sir, for being here today. I appreciate it. Dimitri, please.
So since we've been talking about constipation and clearing, Lacan has this saying about about perversion that I like, because we can read it in a way that he couldn't back in the day. But he said, the pervert, he has object A in his pocket, like this thing right here, basically. And we live in a perverted age, right? How does that show itself? Well, because I'm trying to research it. It's very hard because it's such a taboo. But I know we're all bastards, Like, we take that thing to the fucking bathroom and we shit. And if you are a man, you go to the man public urinals, and then you see a guy like on his phone I don't know if you guys seen this. Like I've seen this. Maybe it's a European thing. I don't know. Anyway, like what is that? What are we doing there, right? Like object A is in our pocket, and so, but object A, what is it? Object A is the je ne sais quoi. It's like that what you don't know. It's the lure. It's kind of the, I like actually Sulphur Springs Valley, how you were describing the aesthetic, that when you really try to thinking, you hit all these like evanescent aesthetic phenomena, and it's kind of like that. I feel like that's kind of like that object A as a concept. It's like you can't really think it as a totality, but only in these weird little glimpses. So anyway, smartphones, they're ubiquitously being enjoyed also on the toilet. Why? What is the phenomenology of that? Well, the object A is not only the lure, it's not only that thing which makes us, which is the impotence for our desire, like the spark, but as Zizek will again and again emphasize, in a way that's his whole spiel, is that the object A is also excremental, right? So it's not only that, and that's really how we come full circle in a way that Lacan would have never guessed, that yes, the pervert has the object A in his pocket, and yes, the feces are a paramount form of the object A, just like the smartphone, and this is why they go so well together on the toilet. on the toilet. So yeah, I've disabled. I always try to look for programs to disable distractions. There's a very nice YouTube extension which is called Unhooked or something. Anyway, it blocks. Let me see. It's called Unhook. Remove YouTube recommended. So you remove the YouTube recommended, and you remove the shorts. You remove all the trending tabs, all the things you don't want to look at because you just want to, see what thing Daniel has uploaded next. So I can just really recommend that extension. But I'm always like looking around for software to like get rid of all these distractions being imposed on me. Why am I mentioning that here? Well, because I can genuinely recommend that, but also because those reels, man, they really get in your head. Like, damn, that's obscene. But I like months ago, I did see a reel. I never found it again, but I thought the reel was very nice, actually. So the reel was a dude, and the story was like what writers do when they find the right word. So obviously, when someone's making a beat and it's like the beat slaps and it's like you got the flow, or whatever with an instrument, like you get up, you dance, you're like screaming, and that guy was basically like being a writer, like like having the right word and then jumping out of his chair, dancing like a madman, that he that he had the right articulation in his essay, and really like it was a parody. But honestly, I'm kind of like that when I'm writing. Like sometimes I'm so astonished about like what I'm saying, and I'm like, wow, I'm really hitting upon something. But that's not the only one, right? I'm not only happily surprised or excited. Sometimes I'm really horrified, or also sometimes I'm quite paralyzed, and there's actually a merit to that. I know that today you don't have to be paralyzed because you can just prompt ChatGPT and it will continue the flow. It will continue the stream of signifiers and of interaction for you. But I actually think that's really stealing something very important, namely the openness to sit with our anxiety. So Aspasia, I really appreciate your thoughts about thinking and kind of the looseness of thinking, and also I guess what has been brought up here about thinking. Is it external? Is it internal? Is it something that happens when we come together, or is it something happens when we retract? And I don't think we can really balance them out and say that one or the other is more important. I think solitude is very important, and the possibility to retract. Sometimes people feel bad about retracting because they feel like they have to enjoy with the others and that they are alienated because they don't know how the others can enjoy it, but they have to do it. But it doesn't feel right, but still they have to do it. It's like, no, you don't have to. Like, you can retract. You don't have to be with those people. Honestly, even if it's your family, like that's sometimes it has to be said. Like that's you can take that space and retract. And yeah, it's like there in English. I like to say that one can say to fall back on oneself, because in one sense, if you look at the definition, to fall back on oneself, it's like you can't go anywhere but to help yourself. But it's also really a falling, right? Like, because what's like the self, it's quite empty, right? Like you fall back on yourself, and how Javier was saying it, like the emotions, the frustrations, the desires, and kind of the convoluted confusion and the looseness of thinking, right? You don't really latch onto anything there, but like that's so valuable, that retraction. And I think that happens during crises. I think Hegel writes about Plotinus in that way, that Plotinus in his when the Roman Empire fell, that's when Roman philosophy started emerging, because you had all these people retracting, like the religion didn't function anymore. Let's say the mercantile many relationships just didn't function anymore. Then you have all these language to describe it with, like the rhetoric and these types of social mechanisms. So that was a big time of retraction, of falling back to oneself. But of course there was also a community, right, of Neoplatonists. So yeah, like Aspasia, what you said really hit me about like thinking through things sufficiently, like as a punishment, right? It's always a punishment. It's like sit through it until you have a point, and then you can come back. But it's never your point. It's always the point that has been imposed on you, right? It's really violent. It's really violent. Um, it is really violent. So yeah, I think the notion of clearing is interesting too. I think, from what I understand, this is something that it comes from Heidegger, and for Heidegger, this is like clearing. Like also in German, it comes out even more, but in English, there's also the etymological root of clearing and clarity and light. But also in German, it's also like a readiness, like being klar, Klarung, Aufklärung, like that. That means being ready also. So there's something interesting about philosophy centering those types of visual metaphors, right? Like the clear sight, especially, right? To see things, to discern things. And why is that? I don't think it's really clear cut. And as a matter of fact, when we talk about sight, I always think about the fact that our mind, like so our actual eyes can't see a certain part, but our mind makes it seem so that we can see everything. But actually, there's a little knot at the end of our eye sockets, that kind of where all the nerves come together, so we don't see a certain spot. There's all these experiments you can do with it, with like putting a hand like here. Probably you guys know about that. Anyway, like I love that, because that's like a good visual metaphor actually for how we think too. Like, to see things clearly, there has to be a blind spot, and it's not about like getting to the blind spot so you can get rid of it. It's like whenever you'll have like an aha eureka moment, like now I can see things clearly. It's like, yeah, because now you're unaware of the blind spot. Like, yeah, you have successfully gotten rid of that confusion, because you got rid of the blind spot that sustains your view. And yeah, so that's one way we can think about clarity and the visual metaphors. But yeah, so my whole thing, I hope I didn't scare you with the excremental the excremental features of our existence. But I've been trying to look it up. Like, are there some like psychologists or is anyone talking about like people using their phones in the bathrooms? And honestly, up till now, I haven't gone so deep. But everything I've been finding is just like, yeah, you'll develop hemorrhoids because, of course, it's very unhygienic. And it's like, yeah, we all know that. It's like, first, it's not going to stop people, and second, it's like, what about the psychology of it? Like, I mean, it's obviously there's also something here about the doctor's gaze and the scientific gaze, right? If you have bowel issues, it's like, yeah, it's very disgusting anyway. But it's like when you go to the doctor, it's like depersonalized, right? But it's like, are we doing something there? I'm reminded of Yanis Varoufakis' techno-feudalism, and he says something so beautiful. He says, techno-feudalism relies on a sanitized tech terror. And so this is how I kind of see. So take Instagram or take Zoom or whatever. All these platforms, they're so sleek, right? Like everything is like beautiful boundaries, nice color schemes. You can do your own configuration, have your own cool wallpaper, dark mode, whatever you want. But then it's like, what are you viewing? Like, if you scroll through the reels, it's like, God damn, you're terrorized. You're terrorized. It's like, it's really violent what they're just pouring out onto our minds, right? In our naked minds. Yeah, it's very sad. So, but it's terrorization. It's like terrorism, digital terrorism of our minds. But it's purely sanitized, so it's clean, right? There's no shit there, but it's all shit, right? But you're like shitting on the toilet when you're seeing that. So I'll stop talking.
No, it's very funny because it's like as you remove the excrement and the dirty, it's actually all crap now, right? Like it's all just taking over your mind. That's really hilarious. And I'll give it to Michael, Sam, and Christian, and then I'm going to pressure Seth to talk about some of the daily ground because I think it's very, very relevant. And it's very interesting because it's almost like you have the unbearable flow of reels or the unbearable flow of thinking. And we have to come to terms with the unbearable flow of thinking, or it's almost like you're dealing with the reels to escape thinking, right? Or just because there's going to be something continual in your life. And so is it going to be reels or is it going to be thinking? And then if you come to terms with thinking, you can change your relationship to it in a manner that it can almost have, like we're saying, this character of being more of a sort of daydreaming, right? Maybe. I also think it's interesting what you're saying about clearing and clear sight, because there's something like a clear sight, but that clear sight is dependent on a certain blind spot, because if you didn't have the blind spot, you wouldn't even be interested in having clear sight, and it also affords the possibility of having clear sight. And then I also think about the clear sight that philosophers are trying to have a lot. I like to think about glimmers and glimpses, Javier and Jacques, and we've talked these. So you're able to see clearly something that appears suddenly and then it's gone. Like you're able to catch evanescent glimmers, right? And like that arises and it's gone. And you have to have the clarity of sight in order to get that grab. But I'll stop and pass it to Michael and then Sam. So Michael, please.
Yeah, I've just been thinking throughout this conversation, like what are the necessary checks and balances to our own thinking that need to be in place to make sure thinking doesn't become idolatrous or become corrupted or like yeah, because we've been talking about like kind of how to get into the flow of thinking, like grounding it in the body, grounding it in breath work, something about not trying too hard, but also not trying to be too passive. But I think the question of like, well, how do we promote quality of thinking? Because I think we all in this group kind of know what that is for ourselves, and I think we have like a collective kind of vibe about like what does quality thinking look like and mean. But I'd love to kind of, I don't know, try my best to tease that out and then hear what anyone else has to say. I just picked up Simone Weil's The Need for Roots, and I'm like 30 pages in, and it's so good so far. And I'm so excited to keep reading it. But uh, one thing she talks about is like she's going through, she has like a list of like necessities for the human soul, and I think it's like 9 or 10 things that are necessary for human flourishing. And one of them she talks about is hierarchy. And she talks about how, every human needs to be instantiated in hierarchies to feel, and then I think that kind of connects with like she has like another necessity is like obligation and responsibility. And I think that kind of ties in with like being part of a hierarchy. But she talks about how it's so important for people in leadership of hierarchies to be represented as symbols as opposed to kind of, being subject to worship by the people underneath them, like that the ultimate service of the collective institution or whatever it is that the hierarchy is embedded within, like they have to go beyond whoever's at the top of the pyramid. And so they, whoever's at the top of the pyramid has to be a symbol for the values, the virtues that the organization is aspiring to, that it has to go like beyond the person. Um, and I think the same can be true with thinking too. If and she also talks about like the kind of problematic notion of doing art for art's sake. Um, and I don't quite feel comfortable enough to like explain what she means by that, but I think there's something in that about like thinking for thinking's sake, where it can very easily kind of collapse into itself and then kind of just become this like kind of noxious, vacuous thing where, you were talking earlier, Daniel, about like when you feel married to your own thoughts is when you kind of know that they're wrong. And I think and I think that's also really promoted when people do their thinking alone because they either fall in love with themselves or they think everything that they're thinking is foolish. Like they're subject to like the worst kind of influences of their self. And and so I don't necessarily think that we only can do our, talking about something Daniel mentioned earlier. Like I don't think we only have to do thinking with other people for it to be um worthwhile. But I think the thinking we do with ourselves still has to be relational. And I think that's a really interesting thing to tease out about like how do we do that? And for me, I was laughing when Christian was talking about, sorry, now I'm just like, this is what happens to my brain in these net conversations. It's just like I'm just constantly pulling from like everything that everyone said, and it's just all these different divergent paths. But he was talking about like talking to himself as a kid, and I had similar probably a series of moments where I realized that I was just a blabbermouth and like no one was listening to me. And I would start talking to myself like in the shower, was just like when I would do it. And it was like, started when I was like 9, 10, 11, whatever. Um, but, and I don't know if this was the experience for a lot of people who would talk to themselves like audibly out loud, but it would be like I was talking to a friend. Like I would like interrogate myself as if like the voice in my head was someone else. Like I'd be like, oh, like, there's this new kid at school, like, and I don't really know how to feel about him. Like, should I be friends with him or like, like, it would be like I was using myself as like my own therapist. And very rarely would the other voice like actually give me anything helpful. Usually he'd just be like, what's going on? But there was this sense that like it wasn't it wasn't totally just like me kind of going in like a neurotic loop, which I also do. That also does happen. But that type of thinking, and I still do it today, although I realize there is a sort of psychoticness to it. So I try and not do it a lot. But my mom and sister just sometimes chuckle because like I'll be like watching a sports game and I'll be like just talking out loud and she's like, "Are you talking to me? Like, is that?" Or and she'll come out and I'm like, "No, sorry, don't worry about it. It's just me going crazy." Yeah. Um, so I think there's a piece about like instantiating relationality, and that doesn't necessarily have to be with another person. It can also be, John Vervaeke talks about like his council of sages that he calls upon in like meditative practices. Socrates, Jesus, although he always says Jesus of Nazareth because I think he's like trying to like keep an arm's length away from Christianity, which is funny. And so I think that's, I think we always do that when we're going about our day, like, the funny tag, the tagline, like, what would Jesus do? Like, I do that with people, living people that I consider wise. I may or may not have done it once or twice or many times with you, Daniel, of like, what would so and so do in this situation? What would so and so say to me in this moment of angst or struggle or confusion or whatever? And then you're still dialoguing. You're still in a dialogue even though that person isn't there. So anyways, yeah, I think I'll pass it back.
I really like the point. I'll give it to Sam here. I really like this idea that even in isolation, there's some sort of relationality. It does seem like so what Dimitri is saying on the idea that isolation can have a very important role. I completely agree, because if you don't have isolation, then when you come into community, you could be needy, you could be avoiding yourself, you could have the wrong motive. So there's some sort of work that needs to be done alone precisely in order to meet the conditions necessary for togetherness. And then, of course, there is togetherness that is avoiding being alone. The question is, what is the quality of the isolation? And it's very interesting because there's almost like the isolation to put yourself under a master, say if you're studying, say, a great book or Hegel, or to enter into the fray of those inner voices. There's something about art that is actually, when you're writing a story, you basically are having a sort of dialogue with yourself, if, in my opinion, if you're doing it correctly, if the characters are alive beyond you, if the work, like if you're writing a philosophy essay that's not just for a grade, unfortunately, when you're doing it for a grade, you're kind of like, what will the professor like? So you're having an indirect conversation with the professor when you should be having it maybe with, the text itself. And there is something very interesting about how I think, so for me, many of the practices of isolation that seem to, in fact, prepare one for togetherness have some sort of interesting relationality quality to them. I think that is very interesting. And yes, to Simone Weil, I will, very, very important. There's more to say, but I'll pass it to Sam. Sam, thank you for being here, man.
Hi. Yeah, I think I'm just probably gonna just like carry on from what Michael was saying, almost like lock and step. Yeah, what I wanted to say was that, well, I think about this a lot because I work in a creative industry where I literally sell like my ideas. Like a good portion of like what I think about each day is not owned by me as property. And I work in a company which is creative, so I'm working on design teams and often with other people who have different ideas of how to generate ideas about what thinking, about how to facilitate thinking. And so when you're up against that kind of friction, you just inevitably think about it a lot. And what I've come to when it comes to thinking and the attendant ideas, my stance towards it is very, I think, like radically animistic. I think like at this point, I feel very comfortable and almost like literally asserting that thoughts and ideas have their own being independent of me. If you don't accept that I think I can still make my case. And I think one of those cases is in the the agency of unreality that we see in fictional objects, such as my conception of Socrates, my conception of Jesus of Nazareth, just as Michael was saying. Like so that's one thing, like the causal potential of fictional objects. But there are agencies and there are potencies in the world, and I think I would say that they have priorities of their own and like intentions of their own, but also they just have logics of their own, and we live inside those logics, and we're dependent on that. To pull up like a Sloterdijk quote, he said, a cerebral individualism would miss the fact that a brain, it only awakens to a certain level of performance through an interaction with a second and larger brain ensemble. And that is enculturation. Like none of us would be talking on Zoom about anything, you know, if we didn't have our mother teaching us language. And a lot of our thought lives in the substrata of language, and language has its own logics and its own syntax and rules. And we're not like free of them. If we want to think, we have to think through them, and not just words and language, but the linguistic capacity as like a whole human faculty, you know, like more, I would say like linguistic capacity in the Taylor definition, where we're lumping in like the semantic content that we receive from a symphony is part and parcel of the broader linguistic capacity. And recently I was listening to a podcast, Kurt Jaimungal, Theories of Everything. I forget the title, but it was like a crazy theory that will break language. And it was just like, this guy, he's like a cognitive scientist and an AI researcher. And basically he's explaining to his audience with a very, he's saying he has discovered that through working with LLMs that actually like signifiers are not strictly tethered to reference, which, you know, it's like, oh, did you discover that? Well, because poets have discovered that like hundreds of years ago, but whatever. So, but if we take his point, you know, like language is a system. It's, you know, and words have their meaning through their relationship to all other words. So if our thinking, like I am speaking to you right now, transmitting my ideas to you with words, you know, like it's tied into this ecology of word beings, and they have relationships to one another. I can't just say apple fudge McIntyre and like that doesn't, you know, like nothing comes to you. So we're playing in that we're like in that semantic ecology, you know, like and it has its own like life ways. And so just to to like bring this back a little bit, language is this thing with its own priorities, you know, and I think ideas are also like that because they kind of live in language. And I think this sort of brings up the Landian black pill like fear, which is that language, you know, like some people think that like that language is a virus infecting a Homo sapiens host. And I kind of like that because it does give idea beings and thought beings a very radically independent existence. But the thing about Landians is they despair of it. You know, they're like, oh, we're controlled. They want to be a cerebral individualist when they don't even realize that interacting with this virus is what gives us like agency, freedom, sentience. Like it's a huge blessing. It's like, I just feel like we don't need to despair over that. There's like, we can just like see it and foster a good working relationship with our virus, you know, like with words and their symbolic like secrets that they can give to us. And then it just comes down to like what you're saying about whether it's with others, other human beings, or whether it's with oneself. Thinking is very relational. And like this comes back to my job, where I've noticed that like sometimes I have relationships with various coworkers where they're like, okay, we need ideas, give us some. And I'm like, okay, let me do my thing. And my thing involves, like making the body feel safe, like all the things that we brought up earlier, like, like the silence, waiting, like a Simone Weil, just waiting, just wait. It works well, So like, I have somebody come to me like, we need ideas. I'm like, okay, I've got techniques, let me try them. And I've had situations where I've been like, here are my ideas. And, like, people can be more or less respectful towards your ideas. Now, if you are married to those ideas, that can be really upsetting and that can affect your relationship to that person. But more critically, I think, is like, if you're somebody having a working relationship with, I don't know, the ideal realm or whatever, wherever thought beings might live, whatever we think kind of ontology they have, even just your relationship to fictions, your knowledge of other architectures, whatever. Like, can thoughts trust you? Do you abate fear long enough for them to actually make themselves heard? Do you honor their secrets? Do you sell them? If you do, why do you sell them? What is the contract through which you sell them? I really think that they care. And I really think like, I think you need to guard your relationship to them, especially if you make your living off of them. Like, like in this situation, if I'm just going to give ideas to somebody who I know will not respect them and who will not, do them justice, like, they're not going to keep coming to me, because I think a thought form is going to ask, like, do you have the right CV? Like, the concept of evolution came to Darwin because he had like hundreds of thousands of hours of like doing pea gardening, and that was important. Like, he had the right CV for that idea complex, to be cheeky about it. Yeah, so the final thing is like, I really don't think we are possibly alone when it comes to thinking. Like, you couldn't be. Because if only for the fact that you stand on the shoulders of giants, like, if that alone, like, you do need, like, to awaken your mind, you need another mind. And I think that good thinking, when you establish a good relationship to thought, and it's like a process of making room for that not aloneness. Like, you're making room for the human, but you're also making room for the more than human. And you're conversing in a multitude of mediums, in language, in bodily sensation, in matter. Maybe it's like natural artifacts, or maybe it's cultural artifacts. And also you're conversing in multiple logics. Maybe it's the logic of math. Maybe it's the logic that is embedded in the relationship between words and language, or maybe it's the logic of dance and corporeal motion, right? Like, you've got all these like ways to work with thoughts. Kind of like, like there's like just like a bajillion Ouija boards in this world, right? Like, one of them might be moving your body, one of them might be writing down words, right? But you've got this sort of matrix of all these different medias, all these different logics. And I think when you experience, when you have an experience of alignment, or like unity between these different parameter spaces, that this is where like it signifies an accord between like yourself, others, thought beings. Like, they can all sort of participate and literally just agree with one another. I think that is what that feeling is. And I like, I mean, not that I can prove this, but I feel like there's like an ontic opportunity that arises as like time and future, you know?
Absolutely brilliant. And also, yeah, mother and smother and brother, that was great in the chat, guys. Other and all those word plays, that was fantastic. What you were saying about thought beings, etc. I think this is invaluable. Personally, where Christian was talking about, and then Seth had some important things on this as well with his work, that I'll throw at him and then Christian, is that I have found it incredibly beneficial to my own life to treat thoughts as if they have a certain being of their own. Let's say you believe, let's say you think that or not. I find I find it incredibly important to do this. Like, so another reason where is like, I find overthinking, like in this kind of unbearable overthinking, is greatly transformed if I think of the thinking as not my own. If it's me, then I'm identifying it in what is having this thought say about me, and it's pulling me somewhere. But if instead it's like thought being, I'm watching a movie. Oh, this is cool. Where's it going to go? Oh, that's neat. There is a completely different relationship to it, right? Because I think a lot of people, I think Aspasia has brought this up on, if you think I'm feeling anger, what kind of bad person am I? What does that mean about me? Where you say, I'm just feeling anger, and a more kind of, it doesn't say anything about you. It just is a fact, right? I think similarly, actually, when thinking has a kind of being of its own, you do not over-identify with the thoughts, nor do you egoically over-identify with the thoughts, and you are able to have a right relationship to them. I think honestly, like fiction writing can be very useful for this, because I think when you do fiction, the experience of characters that come alive is so vividly not you, where they literally become their own person, that then you basically from fiction say, well, what if that's just the case with all thinking? That you're just experiencing something that is not your own. It's working through you, and it's not where it has nothing to do with you, but there's a certain relationality to it. I think the experience of thinking dramatically changes for the better. And like you said, it is very interesting how the Landian has this kind of idea where thinking is kind of like a virus using us for a certain direction. But if instead, well, maybe ultimately the human has to decide their relation with thinking, if it will be for beauty, as Jochen and we've talked about, a beatific vision, or if ideas are going to lead us in the direction of the replacement of humanity by our technology. But there is something very profoundly beneficial, I think, to think of ideas as having a certain being independent of you. I think that helps you not be egoic. I think also because then in isolation too, if you are thinking thoughts or doing work, then you're not thinking about, look what I'm capable of that other people get in the way of, right? Like you can also think of like other people get in the way of my ideas, but if the ideas in a way are not yours, then actually it doesn't translate into you therefore being better than other people, right? And in fact, there might be a kind of responsibility to the ideas, actually, to try to prove able to realize them in the best way for other people. I think, honestly, I guess I would also say that if you think of ideas as having a life of your own, of their own, that also then I think can perhaps create imperative for you to be able to communicate them clearly or to share them in a clear way, where I think some intellectuals may be like, oh, it's complicated, and if you don't get it, who cares? That kind of idea. I think if you think of ideas as actually something that's not yours, then part of your responsibility is actually just kind of the bringing them into the world in a certain manner. That might be better to reach people. I would have to say more on that, but I'll give it to Seth because there is something interesting too, where I think about the more actually you come to be at home in your body, the more you can think in terms of authentic resonance, the more you can have like dealing with anxiety. I think this is what I want to say. Anxiety makes it very difficult to believe ideas have a life of their own. Like anxiety actually and fear and having something wrong in your body actually makes you over-identify with ideas and thinking, and you don't trust in thinking as its own independent process that is working through you. But I know you were talking about overthinking and various things.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot here. I loved what you were saying, Sam, about like you're producing ideas or you're being asked to produce ideas, but do the thoughts in my head trust the person that I'm going to give these ideas to? And I think that goes to I've been in an ongoing conversation with a couple guys. We've just been exploring dialogue in different ways over the course of a year. And in our last conversation, we hit upon the idea of somatic safety. And Sam, you also referred to feeling safe. But if we can think about safety in terms of, I mean, this is a big topic in the world today, but literally like, is it safe to think? Right? Or, we can have like forbidden thoughts, and then, oh, I'm not supposed to think that thought. And I'm just thinking a thought, and the thought, I already feel contracted. Or maybe I have a thought about Daniel and he's sitting right next to me, and it's like in my anxious mind, it's almost as if I think he can hear me, even though it's an internal experience. We can come into that kind of a place. But on the flip side, I just wrote a piece on Substack about this. Is like, if you think about the thing that whatever it would be for you that you just love to talk about, you love to think about, it's your passion, and yet you didn't feel somatic safety with the person in front of you, how capable would you be at speaking at that thing? Like, maybe more capable than other topics because it's your favorite topic, but it's like there's an inhibition. You would feel like you'd be picking the words. You'd be like, well, I don't know if I can really express how I really feel about this in front of another person. Versus, your best friend is there. You feel somatically safe. Suddenly the words you say, or even maybe the thoughts you entertain, are completely different. So we were talking about, what is it to be in conversation such that everyone with me would feel somatically safe in the conversation, right? And I was giving an example. I had been in a sort of open dialogue circle, very superficially format, similar to the net, but just a lot of people, open mic. And on this particular day, I mentioned that I was bored. And someone else said, well, I'm not bored. And it was almost like they were polemicizing with my experience that I chose to share for whatever reason. And then there was a week later, the same group met, and someone was referring to how Seth was bored last week. And it was like, well, I guess it's not safe for me to share that I'm bored. It wasn't like anyone's going to come and get me. I mean, it's on Zoom, but I noticed the inhibition that I felt. It wasn't pure somatic safety, right? Um, but I could say a lot of things, but I thought of actually, because we mentioned before this thing, I'm doing the daily ground, and there's actually a little process that's like directly to what we're speaking about. So I just thought I would offer it to the group. It'll take a few minutes, an experiential thing, but it might go along with what we're doing. Um, it's kind of in the sense of a meditation, but you can just treat it like a little experiment. But a couple things to notice. First of all, there's different forms of thinking, but a lot of it is speaking to ourselves. So one of the things I like to say is thinking makes a sound. And what you can notice sometimes is if you're outside, you're thinking and thinking and thinking, and then finally after several minutes, you finally notice that the birds are singing, right? Because the thinking can actually drown out. So one of the things I think about with thinking to modulate it is just that it's one of many sounds, but how much of the world can I hear right now? Or can I only hear the thinking? But the other thing, and this is the piece that I've been playing with, is I've been using this phrase, wordless wisdom. And all that means is whatever transpires when I'm not in words, right? And I even have this kind of humorously quantifiable way of thinking about it. Like, okay, maybe you sit down to meditate and someone has the idea that I'm just going to be in total silence. I'm in the void, right? A lot of people find that that's difficult to get to. But what if you just thought about how many words go through my head per minute? Could I reduce the number of words? Like, could I put more space so it's not like we're purely going. Anyway, so this is a little thing. You can try it and you can, play with it. But if I were to ask you right now, how are you? Right, just notice, what do you notice? And then just to give yourself a little more space, right? If I said, well, how are you today? Maybe that changes the frame a little bit. Or how are you this week? Okay, so obviously you can keep zooming out. Like, how's this year going? And then you could even say, when you think about the arc of your life and where you are in the arc of your life, like how does this moment feel in terms of the trajectory of your whole life? Okay, so maybe that puts you in a particular space. But with that framing, if I say, how are you? The thing to notice is, are you finding the words to answer my question? Like, are you doing word formation? And we live in culture. We use language all the time, so that would be very natural to do. But the thing to say was, if you go back to how am I at this moment in my life, and I get quiet, well, then if I tell you, if I find words, what was I looking at to like whatever, however articulate I may or may not be, the words that I'm saying to you, what was I looking at and observing to try? So the practice is like, you could do with any question. How are you is very, open. But as you do this thing that we're calling thinking or not thinking, just notice that there's a wordless experience. And then if I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking, I'm going to put it into words. But there's always those two pieces. So I'll just like leave a little more silence because I'm talking a lot, and that's probably the words you're hearing is mine. But if you try to notice how you're doing and you speak, can you go away from the words back to the whatever, that wordless blob that I'm looking at, that I'm trying to describe?
It's very interesting because when you say, how are you? Then you start in a wordless blob. And then if you say, how are you today? There you go. And it's interesting how the scope impacts. But it's also interesting how when you return after going through the various scopes to how are you? How actually that experience also actually feels different.
Well, how are you is like that classic, just social nicety. And when someone asks us, we say fine, and nothing actually happened. I didn't actually go and check how I'm doing and then report on it. But if you try to take that seriously, and what, even if I do check in, or if I say I'm sad, well, the word sad is really not a very good reflection of what I feel inside. That's like churning in me, and maybe sadness is the correct category, but it's just a category. So yeah, anyway, it's a thing that you can play with, but I found it useful, and the sort of idea I'm playing with is just like every time I do that, maybe I don't find pure wordlessness, but if there's like 25 words a minute, maybe it goes down to, I don't know, 18 words per minute, and there's just a little more space in there. And if I had some weird, tracker from Elon Musk or something that was in my brain counting the number of words I think per day, if I could just reduce the number of overall words that I think in the day, this is kind of back to our schedule.
Yeah.
Like, would that just create more of a clearing? Would it create more somatic safety for me? So that's kind of the proposition.
So I'll give it to Christian. But first, if you're bored, you can say so, and we won't bring it up next week. And then second, what's very interesting on that idea of if you're having this unbearable overthinking, then perhaps the problem is the scope. If you were to find a different scope, then you would get the pure experience. And actually that would help you not have the overthinking. And it is very interesting because something I think about all the time is a lot of people accuse philosophy of overthinking. My experience is the exact opposite. Philosophy is how you stop overthinking. Is that actually if you don't do philosophy, you end up overthinking because you have no control or hold on your thoughts, right? And it's interesting to think that actually when you're dealing with philosophy and maybe you deal with abstraction, you're actually making that move of how are you? You're moving it to a place that can actually stop the overthinking and then actually have you observe the feeling and then you talk, right? And how actually, although it can seem like philosophy doesn't care about emotion or experience, by actually moving to perhaps a more abstract scope, it might actually make space to have a firmer foundation on an emotion and experience for the speaking that comes next, actually. And I do think if philosophy is proper it does do something like that.
Mhm.
That it's using abstraction to create that pure experience, which obviously is a Kyoto school phrase and means something different. But it is very interesting. Yeah, because and then also, and then I'll give it to Christian, is with that space, it in the mysterious way that then thinking starts again, that also makes it feel like thought has its own being. Like when you think of when you stop thought and then it appears again,
Mhm.
there's a way in which that helps you experience thought as its own kind of being, as Sam was saying, which then changes your relationship to it. So I really like that. And I
Yeah.
think that's quite powerful. And I'll also note the practices you have on the tying the body and the movement of the neck and to attention.
Mhm.
Also the breathe in, exhale, wait. These are quite lovely on the daily ground. So again, check that out. I also really like what Sam was saying about the worthiness of the idea. I think this is very, very important to be thinking of what are you doing in your life to actually be in the kind of being for an idea to go through or for something to go through, right?
Yeah.
That is a very different way of thinking that is very consequential. But I will stop and give it to Christian, then Michael and Dimitri.
Could I add
Yes,
just
please.
one last thing, just sort of because you're helping me as you reflect on that. This is a hypothetical, like maybe it's not true, but what we could say is there's words and there's wordlessness. And, if someone asks me how I'm doing, I go into the wordlessness and then I come back and report on it. And sometimes I don't feel articulate. But one of the things that I could control intentionally is how long I wait to respond. And of course, this is another thing in conversation. If the other person seems really, I need the answer, spit it out right now, right? But if I can actually just take my time, and some people will do that and they'll aggravate other people, but they wait till the thought is clear. And so the proposal here is just that what we're constantly doing is moving from words into wordlessness, back from wordlessness into words, but we could actually be aware of that movement. And of course, we could easily miss it because it happens, but if you just say, how are you? And I say, I'm fine. It's like, I missed something,
Yeah.
But if I assume there's something there below the words, I could go look at it, then find the words for it. I can just be a little more intentional in working in that space.
I completely agree, and it makes me think of the relationship between speed and not thinking, and how Paul Virilio basically is like the entire society has a certain speed and acceleration that then makes people susceptible to manipulation in politics, economics, but then also to ourselves. Because political manipulation will only be as effective as our self-manipulation to ourselves. And if we're engaged in this kind of speed that does not allow reflection, well, then the people in government do the same, the people in the economy do it. Like these little practices actually then suggests the field of political, economic, and social possibilities as well. And what you were saying makes me think of Aurelio, but I will give it to Christian. And I really like the crab eye, Christian. Like I recognize this creature from something, Christian. I do. But Christian, please.
Yeah, it's
Oh, it's wonderful.
It's a piece of graffiti that was done by Daniel Johnston. He's an outsider musician. It still exists today. It was on the side of a record store when it was first done. That when I lived in Austin, that thing went through many iterations. It became like a taco shop, a bunch of stuff. But the city of Austin will never let that piece of graffiti go away. It's kind of iconic. But Daniel Johnston is a great song. True love will find you in the end. If you just want a little piece of someone's heart today, it's a very moving, beautiful song. Well, okay, it's been a second. I think it was Sam who was talking about, or now I'm not 100% sure, but about thinking alone versus thinking in relation with others. Or maybe it was, I have a lot of notes here and I can't remember who to attribute them to. But it struck me, like lately I've been kind of, I habitually shitpost on Substack. I get very impatient with, what I identify as bad thinking. And I try to be judicious in like how I express myself. But it's, and in the back of my head, I'm always like kind of working up my thesis about like why Substack sucks, or why my discontents with Substack. And it is I think that the thinking is so like the opposite of relational thinking, right? It's thought is given in a way that is promotional. It is given in a way which is like typically like finalizing, right? You know, it's like this is what sells and grabs attention. I mean, this is like the science of clickbait, and but it's also like a unique flavor on Substack, which just irks me because it's like if you love. If you like insight, and I think probably everyone in this room has something of an appetite for insight, it's like going to a buffet and everything is like labeled insight and nothing actually contains insight. So it's just this like incredibly disappointing, like consistently disappointing and frustrating experience for me. And I have to do something about this. I have to either like get myself off of it or change my relationship, or just come to peace with the fact that I'm going to be an incorrigible shit poster on Substack for a long time. I don't know. But it's making me think over the last 24 hours, and then during this conversation as well, about the need, or not, I'm just talking for myself here, but like, so when I was young, like 19, and I've probably told this story at least in part before, but I had my long hour, 45-minute bus rides each way to my job. And I would think about all my discontents with my parents. But I would not stew on them. I would do what kind of Michael was talking about, where I actually was like incredibly generous with my parents, and I would like platinum man the fuck out of their position, and imagine that they were like geniuses, who could like provide counterpoints to every argument I made about like why this thing in my childhood was wrong and that was wrong, blah 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 blah. And it was an amazing process because and I think I've heard this term before. It was like an auto-Socratic method, right? Where you're engaging in that Socratic dialogue with yourself, but you're imagining your Socratic interlocutor, right? And you're like platinum manning the fuck out of yourself, basically. And this for me was a spiritual experience in the end. Like it really changed who I am. It like created weird energetic shifts in my body. It taught me compassion, forgiveness, humility, all of these things. And I'm like, platinum manning is like where it's like steel manning, except you try to create a better version of the other person's argument. Like you try to argue their point even better than they can. And that was not necessarily a high bar with my parents, but I still did my best to like come up with like the best version of what I could imagine a defense would be. But I think part of the reason why I did that with my folks and not just kind of like stewed over my discontents is because I love my parents, and I was seeking resolution, right? I didn't want to just like be right about stuff. I wanted us to feel like we were on the same page, right? And I think, especially in today's culture, being on the same page ideologically and with your opinions is like a big part of how we connect. It's only getting worse, frankly. But so, anyways, I wanted my arguments to be like so solid because I wanted them to actually do the work of bringing myself into better relationship with my parents, not just making them like go away with their tail between their legs, right? And so it was a deep pursuit of truth, and I think that's like the good of philosophy is not really like just coming up with theories and ideas and explanations of shit, but like learning to orient yourself toward truth. So I'm like, do I need to do this? Do I need to like revisit this process with, I don't know, Substack? Do I need to like go back into that world of like, I need to like just sit down and really flesh out my discontents, and maybe there will be something interesting that comes out of that. And I've also just thought like, maybe it's worth writing up that what I went through as a kid with my parents and sharing that, right? Like, this is an interesting thing I did. I'm thinking about calling it the yoga of hate, because that's like spicy, and we'll get maybe clicks. But but it's the idea is like if you follow your discontents all the way through, you kind of come out the other side of the tunnel into union with something deeper. But maybe that's what I need to work on. A couple other things. The idea of like thoughts being like a virus, which Sam brought up as a Landian concept. I'm not super familiar with Land's work, but the thing I think that I don't like about that, and maybe is why it kind of can cause problems for people who maybe land at like a disharmonious relationship with language, is that it implies it goes beyond just saying that, you know, thoughts are kind of like their own phenomenological phenomena. It's when you were personifying or anthropomorphizing them a bit and implying like an intentionality, as if they've got their own pursuits, which I want to say that's a mistake. I'll think about it more, but I want to say that's a mistake. I want to say it's like the kind of classic human thing of we anthropomorphize everything. You know, why God, you know, the disaster happens. Why did you do this to me, God? And like, you know, it's like everything we have to turn it into like an entity and give it agency. And I think the reason it's hard to not do that is because it can kind of put you in a position to question your own sense of agency. It's like, if my thoughts don't have agency, if weather doesn't have agency, do I actually, I mean, what's left of me that I can say has any agency? And that's, you know, speaking of like thoughts that our body isn't ready for, that's like a pretty hard one, like the disorienting. And I'll leave here with like some of the body stuff. I think it's been mentioned in a few different ways so far, but I think it's hard. It is hard to have thoughts that your body isn't ready to feel, right? This can maybe go under the umbrella of somatic safety. It's like, I mean, this is, I think, a large part of like therapy in terms of like creating what feels like a safe environment to think things that you have not thought yet. But it's like when I started meditating, I quickly realized I needed to start doing qigong and physical stuff because I could feel things rising up in my body that I was not ready to handle. And I was like, this is like very somatic, and I need to like condition my nervous system to handle what's coming from this process. And I think that's huge. And I think somatic safety has it's got a lot to it, right? It's the nervous system. I'm allowing myself to be comfortable with silence while I think. So like trauma, I think a large part of like trauma is the fact that it's not safe to think certain things, right? It's not safe to realize certain truths when you're a kid. And so your brain kind of like compartmentalizes experience or ideas or beliefs, and is like, and ideally later on in life, you can find an environment where it is safe to have those thoughts and your nervous system can handle them. But I think this is a theory, you know, but like I think a large part of just like why trauma happens in childhood is because your nervous system is not ready to confront certain truths that life has put in front of you. And even as adults, you cannot be ready. And I think that's why like really like physical fitness even is going to impact your ability to think, because it's going to give you a stronger nervous system that's not going to be overwhelmed. I mean, people literally faint, right? They faint when they're overwhelmed. They lose consciousness when they can't handle a certain reality. So our subconscious genius is just going to be like, no, you can't think that yet. You're not ready for it. It's going to overwhelm you. You need to have a higher emotional capacity. You need to be ready to express, for your body to do things that maybe you're not comfortable with doing, like crying or shaking uncontrollably or smashing something in some cases, right? Like that's a big one, I think, and maybe one of the hardest ones. I'm going on, so I'll really will leave it here. But like thinking thoughts that make you angry, right? And then the physical counterpart to that anger, right? Wanting to like punch something. That can become well, you don't want to get stuck there, right? You don't want to become like a pathological where you're just like, oh, I just hit stuff all the time now. But to allow your body to go through that process of release of anger in a way that is like very visceral and technically violent. Is there a safe space for you to experience that, to scream at the top of your lungs, to thrash about, to be destructive, essentially? I think that's like a very natural and healthy human expression. It's how you survive. But do we feel safe doing that, or does that feel very unsafe? And then does that prohibit us from thinking things that we might otherwise benefit from thinking? Okay, I promised I'd stop after this. I stopped.
I think it's absolutely magnificent. And, Thomas Jockin will be having a class on health, looking at Aristotle, Plato at Halcyon Guild. He did a class on beauty. And he was just here the other day and we were talking about it. And basically, one of the things that he really wants to emphasize is that we've lost sight of actually the necessity of health for thinking. Like, in that actually Aristotle basically says if you're not healthy, you can't do philosophy. And you say, well, what does that mean? Well, because courage is tied to health and the nervous system and all these things. Like, you literally can't think these thoughts because, like you're saying, there are some thoughts that your body can't receive, right? That the nervous system is not trained there. And, like you're saying, there's perhaps something to be said about children who are not ready for those things. But then there's also the idea that they're going to encounter them, or maybe they don't have control over it. So do you have a society or teachers or shaman or people there to actually help guide that if it were to occur? And if not, then we have issues. But it is the relationship between health and thinking is very, very deep. And Mr. Jockin has a course on that just came to mind as you were thinking. The other thing I was just going to say quickly, indeed, Land, I think this is very important. When Land talks about ideas as being a sort of virus, it's kind of tied also to this notion that he kind of plays with on kind of the future is almost orchestrating the present because of certain ideas have a certain trajectory that's going on. And the idea of the ideas having this agency, I think Sam has hit the nail on the head, it's a programming language that humans are kind of programmed by ideas, and therefore there's a kind of determinist outcome. I think this is very different than how like Faulkner talks about Caddy or Dostoevsky talks about the muse, where ideas here is a relational, like the ideas have a certain being and a certain agency, but the agency between the author and the ideas is a relational agency. So it's not a deterministic one. It is more like a gardening. It is more of a give and take. It is more of something that you have to work on and tarry with, right? I do think the phenomenology of the artist, as I like to talk about, I always put as kind of central of thinking about the experience of thinking. And when you do that, you get a non-deterministic experience of ideas having agency, and it becomes more based on a certain relational. I think that's far more proper. And then Miss Willem also noted Taylor's cosmic connections, which I think is very relevant to this. And yes, there's what joint attention is to mimetic, as we had that one talk. What joint attention is to mimetic rivalry, we may think of cosmic connections as that to Land's virus. I think that is very astute. And I will pass it to Michael and then Dimitri. And if anyone has final things to say on this evening, I think we did survive the ultra storm. I am glad, but let me give it to Michael, Dimitri. And again, if anyone has any final things, please, Michael.
Yeah, I think what Christian was bringing in at the end about trauma is super important. I think trauma can be thought of as, less about the inciting incidents, however abusive, painful they might be, not discounting that, but trauma is really the unexpressed emotional reactions to painful events, and a lot of people have talked about that, about how like if a child isn't allowed to express anger or discontent or frustration towards their parent in a healthy way where the parent understands and is secure enough in themselves to be able to not react or take that personally, but to be able to see it as a reflection of, you know, a state of a rift or a state of discontent or something within the system that needs to change to reach a new equilibrium, that then compounds over days, weeks, months, years, and it lives in the body and it can cause autoimmune disorders. It can cause, you know, chronic stress. It can cause chronic pain. It can, you know, all these things can be tied to unexpressed emotion. And, you know, I think really double clicking on the etymology of motion, as it's fundamentally a movement of feeling. And, you know, when you express a feeling that you might think is anger and you actually allow it to move, you realize that there's all these sub layers beneath it. Usually, you know, anger's secret companion is shame or sadness or disappointment. And if you don't even scratch the surface, you don't get to all of these layers. And so I think the connection to the body is quite obvious when you look at emotions that way, because what does the body do? It moves. And so do emotions. And so if you know, there's all these different practices to get us in touch with our feelings and to be wise vessels of their movement, and to be in community with other people that facilitate that are actually able to track that, because when you're first, you know, like for me personally, I grew up in a household where emotions were villainized. They were not allowed to be expressed. Um, and when I first kind of started to unpack my stuff and started, you know, joining circling and Dialogos groups and things like that, like I needed to basically rely completely on other people to kind of track the arc of like what was happening within me, until I got to a place where I could do that for myself, and then I could actually do that for other people. Um, and so the connection to the body is, I think, really apt. And I think it's also completely true that there's a certain level of training the body that needs to take place before we can hold the extent of our emotions, and to really emphasize that shouldn't be done individually, because I think that can also become a thing where, you know, maybe you come in contact with someone who realizes that you're not ready to feel something, or you're not, you know, you're not ready for a certain type of discussion or a certain depth or whatever, and then they're like, oh, okay, so you should just go off on your own and become a gym rat for a year, and then and then we can talk again. It's like that's also, I feel like, missing the mark, where it's, in my experience, it's been through relations with people who accept where I am, what my threshold is, and then through that feeling of psychological safety, um, like kind of inch me to that growing edge, but also know what's too far. Um, and I think that's the skill of like a good mentor, is like they always like the zone of proximal development. Like they keep you just kind of a little bit outside of your comfort zone, so that you grow but not self-destruct. Um, yeah, and I think there's a lot. I'll pass it back, but you know, I think there's a lot more to be thought and said about, and I'd be curious to know what Thomas's ideas on this are, but I think there's a lot more to be thought about. What does health even mean? And in respect to virtue and wisdom, because I also don't think what we're saying is, well, if you just lift a bunch of weights and become super physically strong, that you're all of a sudden, going to have this capacity for wisdom. It's like it's a certain type of training the body. And people talk about like the subtle body. Like I have a friend who's doing this class in body dynamics, which Seth might be familiar with. It's a type of like intentional body awareness that was I understand developed by a woman who lived through World War II, and she worked with a lot of like PTSD, people who experienced PTSD from the war, and like helped reconnect them to their body. And so, there's some strength stuff, but it's not just like it's much more about awareness as opposed to just pure, pump and iron. So I think there's a lot more to be said about what actually we mean by training the body for philosophy as opposed to just training the body.
Yes. And so Mr. Jockin's class is all about that, because it's not about just pumping iron, although pumping iron helps, but it's not the sum of it, right? In fact, one can pump iron to do the other things that are required for actual health. Sometimes pumping iron can actually be a method of avoidance, but it just depends. I will pass it to Dimitri, and then if anyone has any final things. I think also that, Seth and I were mentioning, like you're talking about, there's this inhibiting of the movement of emotion through the body. And, Seth and we been talking a lot about how you actually need to train the body, because you get used to not using the body in a certain way, and there's certain nerve pathways, wiring, where you don't even think about using the body in different ways. And so there's certain movements of the body that you actually gradually don't allow yourself to do anymore. And actually, when you let yourself do those movements again, like putting your head on the ground trying to do a headstand at like 35, it's like, oh my gosh, it does feel like you're opening a new brainwave. But the one I love from Seth, you know how you do this with your hand? Yeah, if you just do this, you change it, it's like an alien technology. You're like, what? Your brain kind of freaks out. Well, you're letting your brain move with the thought. You're letting that feeling move through you. And it's interesting to think that a lot of the problem is people have a lot of inhibitions that do not allow certain emotions to move through them. And that actually leads to all sorts of trouble. So it's interesting to think about emotion. It's thus something that needs to be able to move through, but people have inhibitions that don't allow it. It's also very interesting, like you're saying about communities, like if you send people off, community is supposed to, like, if I think of the word compassion, that's an interesting word because it has passion in it. It's communal passion, but it also means that people meet one another wherever they are in their work or drive, and it tries to facilitate that without like leaving them behind. So I think that the issue is that there's work to be done in isolation, but then when people come together, there has to be a certain, I almost want to say a community of compassion that is working on cultivating and incubating one another's passion. But you do that by meeting people where they're at, but also not leaving them there or saying that's good enough. You meet them where they're at in order to push them up, if you will, but not in a manner that says you have all the answers, but pushing them up alongside you, because like actually there's something bigger than both of us or all of us that we're working toward, right? Like, so you're meeting people to then say, well, you need to move up, but actually the thing that's moving up to it is not to be like me, but actually to all be going toward this greater mystery, if you will, or this greater thing that we're all co-working in. So like that kind of double move, because if you don't do that, you could create a big other or a hierarchy. But if you do that, then I think it starts getting at the sweet spot. There's something to be said also where I really like what Christian was saying about platinum manning, but I will stop and I'll give it to Dimitri. And then if anyone has final things.
I like that you brought up Michael, about melancholia and fury. That's I forgot the exact words you used, but that's what it makes me think. Depression and anger, sadness and anger. And there was a podcast that Cadell Last did with Naden Dolar recently, and he was talking about depression and anger. And when I listened to that, it made me think about something that I'm writing about, namely this idea that this political idea that we're never going to get out of capitalism. We are never going to get out of liberal democracy. So all we can do is accept it and do as best as we can and strive the best that we can to go along with it and to push it forward and to progress. And like that thought is so depressing. It's so disillusioning, you know. It's like it's so disenchanting. It's really this thing of like, you know, it's we're inevitably going to be defeated, but still we have to pretend that something matters and we have to go along anyway. And I think like, isn't that like melancholia? Like you do something but you already know it's not really going to have a lasting impact of any positive significance, right? But still you're doing it. And when I'm saying it like this, it sounds also like cynicism, you know. It's like the cynic doesn't really believe that in what he is doing, but he's doing it anyway because that's what is done, and that is what is has to be done because that is what is always being done. Right. And then there's a type of distance that the cynic cultivates by doing that, but then not taking it seriously too, right? Because that's the thing, like, yeah, it's like liberal democracy, it's like capitalism, it's like, yeah, we gotta do it, but like, let's not take it too seriously. And then that's like, that's really, I feel like the core of cynicism, and like a political cynicism, but also the pervasive impotence and helplessness and hopelessness of the political situation that we are in. But then there's the other side, right? There's the explosive side. There's the side of fury and anger, right? That's the other side of it. And I think I'm going to be very frank. I think the last decade, and I'm a leftist, you know, but I'm a leftist because I'm critiquing the left. That's why I'm a leftist. But for the last decades, the left has just been in this type of thought, and the result of that is Trump. That's the result of like this melancholic, cynical, we have to do it but we don't really care about it and we don't take it seriously. Like, yeah, that's where you get Trump. You get this yearning of for someone who is authentic, right? And if anything, Trump is not authentic at all in what he says, but he's authentic in how he gives you the permission to enjoy, right? Like, here, I'll give you all the permission just to express your anger because I know you've been feeling depressed and I know you're not satisfied with that, right? So I feel like people have been saying this too in 2016 and before, you know, people, I believe Richard Rorty was actually in the early 2000s or something, or maybe in the 90s. He was already saying that the liberal establishment will bring about a strong man. But now we're still living in it. We're deeply in this. So it's like, okay, I mean, I don't want to overgeneralize, and I know these are personal feelings, right? Melancholia and fury there, but still, I do see it's a pattern. Even though I know, like, you can also be very liberal and very furious and stand on, you know, on the square with a board, and you can also be a very, you know, depressed and cynical populist right winger. But generally, there is. It's like, is those really all the two choices that we get? Are we just left with melancholia and fury and just, and I don't think so. I think, and you know, from talking from personal experience, because that is what it's about. I also like that what you said, Michael, that it's like to think in solitude, but to be able to relate it to your relationships, right? Like, instead of like retracting into like a psychotic state where you can't relate and your vocabulary is totally different. But yeah, it's like I really like psychoanalysis because it's like seeing into the truth of melancholia, but also it's really showing, I don't know, I don't want to say a way out of it because that's too positive, and it's like we have to give it a place too. But it shows that it's not everything, you know. You can't reduce everything to it's all doom and gloom. It's not everything is just depression. And okay, so going from personal experience, I think, you know, also I agree with like critiquing art for art's sake and thinking for thinking's sake. I actually think a huge representative of a critic was Marx, because Hegel was all about thinking for thinking's sake. Like if you look at the final sentences of Hegel's entire system in the third book of his encyclopedia, it's not Hegel's own words. He's citing Aristotle there, and he's citing a passage of Aristotle's Metaphysics, where Aristotle is going on about thinking that thinks itself as a thought, and that God is doing it, and it's just this kind of blob of all these words, right? And I mean, it's great. I love that, and I love also being able to retract out of a type of activist space, right? We don't. I hate this political pressure. I find it suffocating. This activist pressure, because I not because I think it's the place from which it comes from is fake. I acknowledge it. Like I'm also feeling impotent. I know. Like what the hell do we have to do? It's like I don't know what we have to do. I don't know. I don't know what we have to do. And like to be an activist is like to be able to say we're going to do it, and therefore out of that we'll like know what we'll do. And it's like, yeah, there's, I mean, if you help concrete lives with that, that's great, you know. And there's so much truth to that I also don't want to lambast. But yeah, I want to also talk about the which first so I like psychoanalysis because of the drive, how it centers the drive. And going from personal experience, I do really feel like I am way less depressed than I have been before, and that I'm way more driven and passionate. And because I also have spaces like the net and friends and, you know, close ones to whom I can speak, to whom I feel addressed, and I can address them, and we have something so much more beautiful than I could ever imagine when I was in those, you know, very bad places where you just feel totally alienated. But like there's something religious about that, right? Like there's something religious about the net too, in the sense that it's every week on Thursday, you know, it's going to be the net if it's not stormy and stuff like this, right? But there's something liturgical about it. And but it's not, I like the net because it's like it's philosophical, but it's not sola scriptura, right? So it's different than philosophy portal in that sense, because philosophy portal is more on the sola scriptura side, more on the side of we have this text, we have the mark scores, right, primary text, and or my reading group, and that's awesome. I love that. But the net, there's a certain looseness that's kind of chaotic. It's like you don't know what is going to be catched right at the net with the subtitle. But yeah, no, there's something great about that. And one more note on the topic of silence and words and language, and there in the whole structuralist revolution was about showing that is words and language is not our thing, but we are things of language, right? And the signifier works in the binary system tied to other signifiers, which will basically logically deduce themselves in a manner that's actually quite predictable, which is also, of course, why ChatGPT can seem so human, right? It's really like I really think we shouldn't underestimate the extent to which we assume those chatbots to be humans. Like our unconscious are is like, yeah, that's a human. That's a human. And I think it's mega dangerous. I think we have no idea what it's doing to us. But yeah, like language is its own type of system. On the other hand, we can't reduce everything that's human and everything that's psychological or everything that's in existence to language. There is something about the truth. I wouldn't say only of wordlessness as silence, but also of things like hiccups and coughing and laughing and crying and screaming and even like stumbling upon your words or just suddenly being mute. Like those psychoanalysis is always very suspicious if you're suddenly mute, like when you're like, oh, I forgot this one word. From a psychoanalytical lens, it's like it's never really innocent. It's never just because you have your cognition is just deficient, but it's like maybe there's really something there psychologically, right? So anyhow, that's Freud's approach to such things. And in Ladon Dollar's book, he goes on about laughing, and then so there's linguistics, and there's a sense to which we are being spoken by our words. We're being driven by language, right? It's not us who are using language. Language uses us. Structuralism. But then there's also the pre-linguistic side, right? Of like the baby who doesn't have an eye, right? There's no notion of the eye with the baby because that's a thing of language. And coughing is also like on that pre-linguistic side, right? It's animalistic, also burping, also animals burp. It's very funny. But then there's also the post-linguistic thing, like the things animals don't do, but uniquely we humans do it, like singing, right? Like especially singing that severs itself from the word. Like it starts with words, but then the choir, it's like once it gets more exalted, it's like it detaches itself from the word, and it's like, yeah, these pure sublime beauty that we are so that we're so captivated by. But then Dollar says, okay, so there's the pre-linguistic, there's the linguistic, and there's the post-linguistic. But he says there's also something that's not linguistic, but it's both pre-linguistic and post-linguistics. And he says this is laughing. Because laughing, on the one side, it's very animalistic. It's like pumping out weird noises in a very weird cadence from your throat and your diaphragm, right? Your abs. But on the other hand, it's like only we humans laugh. It's the most human thing ever, right? So it's and the wild thing about the whole non-linguistic and linguistic thing is that if I'm coughing like this, like it's like, yeah, it's non-linguistic, but on the other hand, it means something, right? Because I'm showing it to give an example of it's like not a neutral cough. It's not just a bodily function that erupts, but I'm pointing to that with language and saying, look, look at this. This is a linguist. I'm treating it as if it's a word, almost. Yeah. So these are all things that come up with me for like language is so important, and yeah, indeed, like language comes from the other. It's not us who are really in control of it. On the other hand, we're also kind of condemned to being responsible for what we say and what we don't say. But yeah, I think the very especially in German, the whole language is replete with like giving hearing to something and listen, like in German to obey and to listen is the same word. So it's like when I listen to someone and I'm hearing them, when I hear them, I'm also immediately obeying them, right? And this is also what's so violent about like meeting someone new and they immediately going off about a story that you don't know if you care about yet, but they look a bit weird and you don't know who this person really is. It's like, oh, you're like, get out of my mind. And then maybe if you listen for longer, you're like, oh wait, actually I didn't think about it. That's a pretty interesting thought, or not, and they just keep on yappering on about something you don't care about, and you're like, damn, how am I going to get rid of this? And then you say you have to go to the toilet so you can get your phone and watch some reels. Okay, I'll leave it. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, there you go. That's why everyone is on the phone. So that's hilarious. I've enjoyed this immensely. Thank you, everyone. And I think, just as a few things, before I forget, I think what Christian was saying on platinum manning is absolutely a very powerful way to actually maintain social relations between difference, to humanize. I definitely think, honestly, if you want to do good writing, you do that. Like, like if you just say, well, Jordan Peterson's an idiot or whatever, no, platinum manning. Or Marx is an idiot, no, platinum man him. No, everyone. Like, if you don't do this, and actually platinum man two people in the same work that disagree. There we go. Now we have work. Like, and I think that's just, I think it humanizes. I think it absolutely humanizes. And I think that's very powerful. I like the solitude relation. I was also going to comment on the sola scriptura, kind of Pentecost, you could almost say Pentecostal spirit kind of net sort of thing. Basically, for me, I almost relate in my mind subconsciously isolation with sola scriptura and community with the Pentecostal thing. And basically, if you don't get both, you're in huge trouble. Like if Pentecostal religion does not have sola scriptura, they become psychotic and they get into a whole lot of trouble. But if you have sola scriptura without the Pentecostal, you end up in Big Brother neurotic and authority structures, right? So you have to have both.
So what's the Pentecostal?
Pentecostal would be very spirit-led. It is going to be like you have tongues, you have dancing, you have a lot more of just kind of a sort of ecstatic, you could say the ecstatic sort of Christianity. You can see Pentecostalism. And also Pentecostalism, you could say, I think Pentecostalism has been the fastest growing part of Christianity in the West for like 15 to 20 years. I think that even applies now to South America in different parts. But Pentecostalism has exploded, which actually Lacan would have seen coming because, well, the need for the Pentecost, the release when people have these sort of orders, it fits into the psyche. I actually like thinking Pentecostalism with Lacan, but that would open a lot. But I think it's actually a very important thing. It is different from evangelicism. Actually, I would argue it's a response to evangelicism. A lot of it were people from evangelicism, but wanted to go actually instead of a exegelical or a post-gelical direction, they wanted to go into a more spirit-led direction with Holy Spirit. But this gets into, like, one of the things I talk about with Cadell is the dangers of Holy Spirit without subjective destitution. Holy Spirit has to come through the death of God, per se. It has to come through Jesus on the cross. If you skip the cross to go to the Spirit, you can have just as many trouble. And that actually could be the dangers of community without subjective destitution. It will destroy you. And I actually think Pentecostalism has been a very destructive force without the sola scriptura and without the subjective destitution. Now, I'd have to make these arguments, but I think it's a very important movement. The other thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it to Seth for final thoughts on just anything at all, is what you were saying about psychoanalysis not being overly negative, but also it's an alternative to just the fury melancholy. I completely agree. One of the things I really think is very powerful for me about psychoanalysis is when you take these things seriously and you see these various pitfalls, we can just say in relation to the big other or the non-relation to the big other, et cetera, so forth. For me personally, that almost gives more permission to say, well, I'll just follow the drive because I'm otherwise going to end up in a problematic political program, or to actually treat these ideas with being and go, okay, well, I'm just going to do where the idea is leading me right now. And now, of course, the key is there's no guarantee that the idea is going to work out or that if you follow your drive, it's going to work out. But that's where you're not, it's more positive than cynicism, but it's not the positive of a guarantee, right? That's what I think you have to look for, is like, how do you not just fall into what's the point, cynicism, but also, yeah, we don't know if it's going to work out. Like if you follow your drive, or you follow your, the entrepreneurship, or you follow your creative impulse. But then if you knew it couldn't create courage, like if you actually knew that it had an outcome, it couldn't change you as a subject in the pursuit of it, right? And I think that's actually extremely important. The very fact that the very fact that your drive is not guaranteed is actually why it can be a source of virtue. But it also, because it genuinely could fail. But that also is the context, and with, to what was also said on Thomas Jockin with Aristotle and health. Health can only actually be generated in a context where real failure is possible. Which is very odd, but I think it's actually true, because the demands on the character to do something without guarantee actually is the only condition where a kind of full being health is possible. Now that is open-ended. more would have to be said. But I'll throw it at Seth, and then we're going to eat whatever, the wonders and so on and so forth. But Seth, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, this is super fun. The net feels different when you're sitting right next to Daniel. I can assure you of that. Daniel suggested I should just mention, if people are seeing the video, the daily ground practice that I've been doing. So SethDellinger.com, SethDellinger. And actually, I think if you just go to the website, I think that's on the front page right now. But if not, you can /daily-ground. Yeah, but it was really fun to be here, and we had been talking about the phenomenology of thinking, and it seemed to like catch a spark. And I just noticed it was really to me, I want to say it felt good to hear everyone talking about their own inner experience. I feel like this is just like, how can I think more harmoniously? That's not actually a simple question, but I think we're actually all grasping or grappling with it. I think Dimitri spoke a lot to the current situation in the world, which, I mean, if anything else, it makes me feel like I ought to be doing something right now. Except, what if I don't know what to do? So how can I like navigate that without becoming totally, feeling pathological about it? And just sort of like on the theme of today, I would also just notice, Dimitri also mentioned this as well, but like, if you can happen to recall how you felt when you logged on to the net today, like, is there a change in the body just by being here and exchanging ideas with others, thinking together, as Aspasia was talking about? That's really fascinating to me, because I'm often working with people and we start with the body and say, well, if we do something with the body, do you feel like your thinking is clearer? But actually, if you clarify your thinking through dialogue, it might create more of a sense of clarity in the body. So I definitely noticed that, like, just the energy of the conversation is definitely in me now. So that's good. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. I think that's so important, because the energy of thought can, like you say, create an energy in the body, but then the energy in the body can create the thought. And I think, honestly, as just a very practical guide, if you're feeling stuck in thought, well, then maybe what you should do is focus on energy in the body, and then but if you're feeling stuck in the body, then maybe there's a clarity of thought. And it just makes me think of that line Michelle was saying that the girl she was listening to said, where so he was saying on this kind of health and talking health and different things, and he says, a lot of people are very concerned about what they eat at dinner, but they're not as concerned about what they feel like they can't talk about at dinner. And the point that the person was making is that both of those are equally health matters. If you're sitting at the table and feel like you can't talk about a certain issue because your dad will be upset or your husband will shut you down, that has just as much health impact as the nutrition of the meal that you have, right? And that it's actually kind of both that is going on, that we have a lot of concern about what we are eating, but not what we don't feel like we can talk about at dinner. And I think there's a similar move going on. Like, and like, if you're got a really good diet and you're working, you're pumping iron and doing those things, but there's still a blockage in your life, well, maybe this is when you need philosophy, right? But then, you feel like the philosophy, is blocked, and well, then you need to change your diet, right? And then that gives you a kind of dialectic by which you are fixing something in the feedback loop to get the movement going again and reattuning to the musicality of being. But Daniel, thank you for being here. It's wonderful to have you. Christian, thank you. And Dimitri, thank everyone for coming today. This was a ton of fun. And thank you all. It's been a treat. Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Christian. Really appreciate it. All the best.